This is a story by Ambrose Bierce called The Damned Thing. By the light of a tallow candle which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not apparently very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light on it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent, motionless, and the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in through the aperture that served as a window all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness. The long, nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing trill of tireless insects in trees, and the strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of the day. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. By the rugged faces, they were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodsmen. Now, the person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly. Although there was that in his clothing and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, which attested a certain fellowship with his environment. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he may have assumed or cultivated with just as appropriate to one in authority, for he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead man's things, here in his cabin, where the inquest was taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment, the door was pushed open, and a young man entered. He clearly was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwelt in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, from riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I'm sorry to have kept you. I went away not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I am called back here to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper differs probably from that which you will give here under oath." "That is as you please," said the other rather hotly. "I have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is fantastic, but as fiction. But it may go as a part of my testimony under oath." "But you say it is incredible." "That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear it is true." The coroner was silent for a time, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin whispered to one another, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn. "What is your name?" "William Harker." "Age?" 27. "You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?"
"Yes."
"You were with him when he died?"
"Near him."
"How did that happen? Your presence, I mean."
"Well, I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories."
"I sometimes read them."
"Thank you."
"Stories in general, not yours." "Relate the circumstances of this man's death. You may use any notes or memoranda that you please."
The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle, and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, began to read. "The sun had hardly risen when he left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said the best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the brush. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the brush, Morgan was but a few yards in advance, and suddenly we heard, at a little distance to our right and partly in front, a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. 'Oh, we've started a deer,' I said. 'I wish we'd brought a rifle.' Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated brush, said nothing,
but he had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you're not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still he did not reply. But catching a sight of his face, as he turned it slightly toward me, I was struck by the intensity of his look. Then I understood that we had serious business at hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet. The sounds ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it?" I said. "What the devil is it?" "That damned thing," he said, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly towards us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon. We so rely upon the orderly operation of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement of the brush and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulder and fire both barrels at the agitated grain. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand. At least I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it. Then a shifting of his position would bring all into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds. Yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler, vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of man or brute. For a moment only I stood irresolute. Then throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from some kind of fit or convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased, but with a feeling of such terror as even these awful events had not inspired, I now saw again the mysterious movement of the wild oats, prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of a wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body. The chest and sides looked as if it had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief which had been passed under the chin and knotted on the top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has already been explained to you. If there's something you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict. The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner. What asylum did this your witness escape from? Mr. Harker, said the coroner, quietly and tranquilly, from what asylum did you last escape? Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. If you have done insulting me, sir, said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, I suppose I am at liberty to go? Yes. Harker started to leave, but paused, with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than a sense of personal dignity. That book that you have there. I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like this book. We'll cut no figure in the matter, said the coroner. All the entries in it were made before the writer's death. As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and a scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which with various degrees of effort they all signed. We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion. But some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits. In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having probably a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worthwhile to confuse the jury. The page the coroner is looking at now begins, would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always towards the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alteration in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some cerebral center with images of the thing that emitted them? September 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the home, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh, I don't like this. The coroner turns over several weeks. September 27th. It has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning, the fresh footprints were there as before. Yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer. I have invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October 7th. I have the solution of the mystery. It came to me last night suddenly as if by revelation. How simple. How terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord to that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They're too high or too grave. I have observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, the tops of several trees, all in full song, and suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. It is known to seamen that a school of whales, basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean miles apart with the convexity of the earth between, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded. Too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades of the deck, who nevertheless feel its vibration in the ship, as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, a chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the whole chromatic scale. I am not mad. There are colors that we cannot see. And God help me, the damned thing is of such a color. Yeesh. It's by a gentleman named Ambrose Bierce, who's most famous, at least as far as I'm concerned, for a story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which I may do here some other day. This is a very short one, a little lighter in tone, a light little ghost story by a man named Saki, called The Open Window. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something which would duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. I know how it will be, his sister had said, when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You'll bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as I remember, were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Do you know many of the people around here? Said the niece. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister is staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago. She gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt. Only her name and address. The caller was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy? You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece. She indicated a large French window that opened onto the lawn. It is quite warm for the time of the year, said Frampton. But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window, 3 years ago, to the day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every day until quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white mackintosh over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, Bertie, why do you bound? Because it always got on her nerves so. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. I hope Vera has been amusing you. She has been very interesting. I hope you don't mind the open window. My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it? She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate and only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. Oh, the doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and an avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, said Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement. No, said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened to alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Oh, and here they are at last, just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they're muddy up to the eyes? Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey a sympathetic comprehension. But the child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, I said, Bertie, why do you bound? Frampton grabbed wildly at his hat. And the half door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages. In his headlong retreat, a cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. Ah! Well, here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. And who was that who bolted out as we came up? Most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Sappleton. Could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One wouldn't think that he'd seen a ghost. I expect it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance at short notice was her specialty. Strange little child. H.P. Lovecraft is generally thought of as a writer of demons and gore, Cthulhu and Arkham. I'm not going to get that disgusting today. But H.P. Lovecraft wrote one story that I rather liked, more of a Poe feeling to it, rather poetic, or Poesque, or whatever the word should be, about a man trapped in a vault overnight, one of Poe's favorite topics. This is a man who hasn't got the sense to be afraid, no imagination, which means no respect for the dead, which maybe could have saved him. In the Vault by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, there's nothing more absurd, as I view it, than that conventional association of the homely and the wholesome, which seems to pervade the psychology of the multitude. Mention a bucolic Yankee setting, a bungling and thick-fibered village undertaker, and a careless mishap in a tomb, and no average reader can be brought to expect more than a hearty, albeit grotesque, phase of comedy. God knows, though, that the chilling tale which George Birch's death permits me to tell has in it aspects beside which some of our darkest tragedies are light. Birch acquired a limitation and changed his business in 1881. He never discussed the case when he could avoid it. Neither did his old physician, Dr. Davis, who died some years ago. It was generally stated that the affliction and shock were results of an unlucky slip, whereby Birch had locked himself for 9 hours in the receiving tomb of Peck Valley Cemetery, escaping only by crude and disastrous means. But while this much was undoubtedly true, there were other and blacker things which the man used to whisper to me in his drunken delirium toward the last. He confided in me because I was his doctor, and because he probably felt the need of confiding in someone else after Davis died. Now, Birch, before 1881, had been the village undertaker of Peck Valley, and was a very callous and primitive specimen, even as such specimens go. The practices I heard attributed to him would be unbelievable today, at least in a city. And even Peck Valley would have shuddered a bit had it known the easy ethics of its mortuary artist in such matters as the ownership of costly laying out apparel invisible beneath the casket's lid, and the degrees of dignity to be maintained in posing and adapting the lifeless tenants in containers not always calculated with the sublimest accuracy. Now, most distinctly, Birch was lax, insensitive, and professionally undesirable. Yet I still think he was not an evil man. He was merely crass, often full of liquor, thoughtless, careless, as his easily avoidable accident proves, and without that modicum of imagination that holds the average citizen within certain limits fixed by taste. Now, just where to begin Birch's story I can hardly decide, since I am no practiced teller of tales. I suppose one should start in the cold December of 1880, when the ground froze and the cemetery delvers found they could dig no more graves until spring. Fortunately, the village was small and the death rate low, so that it was possible to give all of Birch's inanimate charges a temporary haven in the single antiquated receiving tomb. The undertaker grew doubly lethargic in the bitter weather and seemed to outdo even himself in carelessness. Never did he knock together flimsier and ungainlier caskets, nor disregard more flagrantly the needs of the rusty lock on the tomb door, which he slammed open and shut with such nonchalant abandon. At last the spring thaw came, and graves were laboriously prepared for the 9 silent harvests of the grim reaper that waited in the tomb. Birch, though dreading the bother of removal and interment, began his task of transference one disagreeable April morning, but ceased before noon because of a heavy rain that seemed to irritate his horse after having laid but one body to its permanent rest. That was Darius Peck, whose grave was not far from the tomb. Birch decided he would begin the next day with little old Matthew Fenner, whose grave was also nearby. On the afternoon of Good Friday, then, April 15th, Birch set out for the tomb with horse and wagon to transfer the body of Matthew Fenner. That he was not perfectly sober, he subsequently admitted, though he had not then taken to the wholesale drinking by which he later tried to forget certain things. He was just dizzy and careless enough to annoy his sensitive horse, which, as he drew it viciously up at the tomb, neighed and pawed and tossed its head, much as on that former occasion when the rain had seemingly vexed it. The day was clear, but a high wind had sprung up, and Birch was glad to get to shelter as he unlocked the iron door and entered the side hill vault. Another might not have relished the damp, odorous chamber with the 8 carelessly placed coffins. But Birch in those days was insensitive and was concerned only in getting the right coffin for the right grave. He had not forgotten the criticism aroused when Hannah Bixby's relatives, wishing to transport her body to the cemetery in the city where they had moved, found the casket of Judge Capwell beneath her headstone. The light was dim, but Birch's sight was good, and he did not get Asaph Sawyer's coffin by mistake, although it was very similar. He had indeed made the coffin for Matthew Fenner, but had cast it aside at last as too awkward and flimsy, in a fit of curious sentimentality aroused by recalling how kindly and generous the little old man had been to him during his bankruptcy 5 years ago. He gave old Matt the very best his skill could produce, but he was thrifty enough to save the rejected specimen, and used it when Asaph Sawyer died of a malignant fever. Now, Sawyer was not a lovable man, and many stories were told of his almost inhuman vindictiveness and tenacious memory for wrongs, real or imagined. To him, Birch had felt no compunction in assigning the carelessly made coffin, which he now pushed out of the way in his quest for the Fenner casket. Now, it was just as he recognized old Matt's coffin that the door slammed to in the wind, leaving him in a dusk even deeper than before. The narrow transom over the wall
over the door admitted only the feeblest rays, so that he was reduced to a profane fumbling as he made his halting way among the long boxes toward the latch. In this funereal twilight, he rattled the rusty handles, pushed at the iron panels, wondered why the massive portal had grown so suddenly stubborn, and shouted loudly to his horse outside, who could do no more than neigh in unsympathetic reply. For the long-neglected latch was obviously broken, leaving the careless undertaker trapped in the vault, a victim of his own oversight. Ah! Something must have happened about 3:30 in the afternoon. And Birch, a practical man, did not shout long. But he proceeded to grope about for some tools, which he recalled seeing in the corner of the tomb. It is doubtful whether he was touched at all by the horror and exquisite weirdness of his position. But the bald fact of imprisonment, so far from the dim daily paths of men, was enough to exasperate him thoroughly. Unless chance presently brought some rambler hither, he might have to remain all night, or longer. The pile of tools soon reached, and a hammer and chisel selected, Birch returned over the coffins to the door. The air had begun to be exceedingly unwholesome, but to this detail he paid no attention, as he toiled, half by feeling, at the heavy and corroded metal of the latch. He would have given much for a lantern or bit of candle, but lacking these, bungled semi-sightlessly as best he might. When he perceived that the latch was hopelessly unyielding, at least to such meager tools and under such conditions as these, Birch glanced about for other possible points of escape. The vault had been dug into the side of a hill, so that several feet of earth made the walls utterly useless to consider. Over the door, however, the high slit-like transom in the brick facade gave promise of possible enlargement to a diligent worker. Hence, upon this his eyes long rested as he racked his brains for means to reach it. There was no ladder in the tomb, and the coffin niches on the sides and rear, which Birch seldom took the trouble to use, afforded no ascent to the space above the door. Only the coffins themselves remained as potential stepping stones. And as he considered these, he speculated on the best method of piling them up like blocks. 3 coffin heights, he reckoned, would permit him to reach the transom, but he could do better with 4. Now, he could not but wish that the units of his contemplated staircase had been more securely made, though I doubt he had imagination enough to wish that they were empty. Finally, he decided to lay a base of 3 parallel with the wall, to place upon this 2 layers of 2 each, and upon this a single box to serve as a platform. This arrangement could be ascended with a minimum of awkwardness, and would furnish the desired height. And so the prisoner toiled in the twilight, heaving the unresponsive remnants of mortality with little ceremony as the miniature Tower of Babel rose course by course. Several of the coffins began to split under the stress of handling, and he planned to save the stoutly built casket of little Matthew Fenner for the top, in order that his feet might have as certain a surface as possible. In the semi-gloom, he trusted mostly to touch to select the right one. Indeed, he came upon it almost by accident, since it tumbled into his hands as if through some odd volition, after he had unwittingly placed it beside another on the 3rd layer. The tower at length finished, and his aching arms rested by a pause, during which he sat on the bottom step of his grim device. Birch cautiously ascended with his tools, and stood abreast of the narrow transom. The borders of the space were entirely of brick, and there seemed little doubt that he could shortly chisel away enough to allow his body to pass. As his hammer blows began to fall, the horse outside whinnied in a tone which may have been encouraging and may have been mocking. In either case, it would have been appropriate, for the easy-looking brickwork was unexpectedly solid. Dusk fell and found Birch still toiling. He worked largely by feeling now, since newly gathered clouds hid the moon. And though progress was still slow, he was sure, get out by midnight. Though it is characteristic of him that this thought was unhinged by eerie implications. Undisturbed by oppressive reflections on the time, the place, and the company beneath his feet, he philosophically chipped away the stony brickwork, cursing when a fragment hit him in the face, and laughing when one struck the increasingly excited horse that had pawed near the cypress tree. In time, the hole grew so large he ventured to try his body in it now and then,
shifting about so that the coffins beneath him rocked and creaked. Must have been about midnight at least when Birch decided he could get through the transom. Tired and perspiring despite many rests, he descended to the floor and sat a while in the bottom box to gather strength for the final wriggle and leap to the ground outside. The hungry horse was neighing repeatedly and almost uncannily, and he vaguely wished it would stop. He was curiously unelated over his impending escape and almost dreaded the exertion, for his form had the indolent stoutness of early middle age. As he remounted the splitting coffin, he felt his weight very poignantly, especially when, upon reaching the topmost one, he heard that aggravated crackle which bespeaks the wholesale rending of wood. He had, it seems, planned in vain when choosing the stoutest coffin for the platform, for no sooner was his full bulk again upon it than the rotting lid gave way, jouncing him 2 feet down on a surface which even he did not care to imagine. Maddened by the sound, or by the stench which billowed forth even into the open air, the waiting horse gave a scream that was too frantic for a neigh and plunged madly off through the night, the wagon rattling crazily behind it. Birch, in his ghastly situation, was now too low for an easy scramble out of the enlarged transom, but gathered his energies for a determined try. Clutching the edges of the aperture, he sought to pull himself up when he noticed an apparent drag on his ankles. In another moment, he knew fear for the first time that night. For struggle as he would, he could not shake clear of the unknown grasp which held his feet in relentless captivity. Horrible pains, as of savage wounds, shot through his calves, and in his mind was a vortex of fright mixed with an unquenchable materialism that suggested splinters, loose nails, or some other attribute of a breaking wooden box. Perhaps he screamed. At any rate, he kicked and squirmed frantically and automatically while his consciousness was almost eclipsed in a half-swoon. Instinct guided him in his wriggle through the transom and in the crawl that followed his jarring thud onto the damp ground. He could not walk, it appears, and the emerging moon must have witnessed a horrible sight as he dragged his bleeding ankles toward the cemetery lodge, his fingers clawing the black mold in brainless haste, and his body responding with that maddening slowness from which one suffers when chased by the phantoms of nightmare. There was evidently, however, no pursuer, for he was alone and alive when Armington, the lodgekeeper, responded to his feeble clawing at the door. Armington helped Birch to a bed and sent his little son for Dr. Davis. The afflicted man was fully conscious, but would say nothing of any consequence, merely muttering such things as, "Oh, my ankles, let go," or "shut in the tomb." Then the doctor came with his medicine case and asked crisp questions and removed the patient's outer clothing, shoes, and socks. The wounds for both ankles were frightfully lacerated about the Achilles tendons, seemed to puzzle the old physician greatly, and finally almost to frighten him. His questioning grew more than medically tense, and his hands shook as he dressed the mangled members, binding them as if he wished to get the wounds out of sight as quickly as possible. For an impersonal doctor, Davis's ominous and awestruck cross-examination became very strange indeed as he sought to drain from the weakened undertaker every last detail of his horrible experience. He was oddly anxious to know if Birch were sure, absolutely sure, of the identity of that top coffin in the pile, how he had chosen it, how he had been certain of it as the Fenner coffin in the dark, and how he had distinguished it from the inferior duplicate coffin of vicious Asaph Sawyer. Would the firm Fenner casket have caved in so readily? Davis, an old-time village practitioner, had of course seen both at their respective funerals, as indeed he had attended both Fenner and Sawyer in their last illnesses. He had even wondered at Sawyer's funeral how the vindictive farmer had managed to lie straight in a box so closely akin to the diminutive Fenner. After a full 2 hours, Dr. Davis left, urging Birch to insist at all times that his wounds were due entirely to loose nails and splintering wood. What else, he said, could ever in any case be proved or believed? But it would be well to say as little as could be said and to let no other doctor treat the wounds. Birch heeded this advice all the rest of his life until he told me the tale, and when I saw the scars, ancient and whitened as they were, I agreed that he was wise in so doing. He always remained lame, for the great tendons had been severed. But I think the greatest lameness was in his soul. His thinking processes, once so practical and logical, had become ineffaceably scarred, and it was pitiful to see him jump at words like Friday, tomb, or coffin. His frightened horse had gone home, but his frightened wits never quite did that.
He changed his business, but something always preyed upon him. It may have been just fear, and it may have been fear mixed with a queer, belated sort of remorse for bygone crudities. His drinking, of course, only aggravated what he sought to alleviate. When Dr. Davis left Birch that night, he had taken a lantern and gone to the old receiving tomb. The moon was shining on the scattered brick fragments and marred facade, and the latch of the great door yielded readily to a touch from the outside. Steeled by old ordeals in dissecting rooms, the doctor entered and looked about, stifling the nausea of mind and body that everything in sight and smell induced. He cried aloud once, and a little later gave a gasp that was more terrible than a cry. Then he fled back to the lodge and broke all the rules of his calling by rousing and shaking his patient and hurling at him a succession of shuddering whispers that seared into the bewildered ears like the hissing of acid. It was Asaph's coffin, Birch, just like I thought. Oh, I knew his teeth, with the front ones missing. Never, for God's sake, show those wounds. The body was pretty badly gone, but if ever I saw vindictiveness on any face, or former face. You know what a fiend he was for revenge. How he ruined old Raymond 30 years after their boundary suit, and how he stepped on the puppy that snapped at him a year ago last August. He was the devil incarnate, Birch, and I believe his eye for an eye fury could beat time and death. God, his rage, I'd have to have it aimed at me. Why did you do it, Birch? He was a scoundrel, and I don't blame you for giving him a cast-aside coffin, but you always did go too damn far. Well enough to skimp on the thing in some way, but you knew what a little man old Fenner was. I'll never get the picture out of my head as long as I live. You kicked hard, for Asaph's coffin was on the floor. His head was broken in, and everything was tumbled about. I've seen sights before, but there was one thing too much here. An eye for an eye. Great heavens, Birch, but you got what you deserved. The skull turned my stomach, but the other was worse. Those ankles cut neatly off to fit Matt Fenner's cast-aside coffin. Ew. We usually think of Roald Dahl as a children's story writer. He wrote James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which they filmed as Willy Wonka. He's got a lot of dark comedy in his kids' stories. He wrote a lot of stories for grown-ups, too. Even more dark comedy, suspense, horror. Several of his best stories were filmed as episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, including this story, Man from the South. It was getting on toward 6 o'clock, so I thought I'd go out and sit in a deck chair by the swimming pool, have a little evening sun. In the pool, there were 3 or 4 girls and about a dozen boys, all splashing about, making a lot of noise, throwing a large rubber ball at one another. The girls were English girls from the hotel. The boys I didn't know about, but they sounded American. And I thought they were probably naval cadets who'd come ashore from the U.S. naval training vessel, which had arrived in harbor that morning. I noticed a small, oldish man walking briskly around the edge of the pool. He was immaculately dressed in a white suit, walked very quickly with little bouncing strides, pushing himself high up onto his toes with each step. He had on a large, creamy Panama hat, and he came bouncing along the side of the pool, looking at the people and the chairs. He stopped beside me and smiled, showing 2 rows of very small, uneven teeth, slightly tarnished. I smiled back. Excuse, please, but may I sit here? Certainly, I said. Go ahead. He sat down and crossed his legs. His white buckskin shoes had little holes for ventilation. A fine evening. They are all evenings fine here in Jamaica. I couldn't tell if the accent was Italian or Spanish, but I felt fairly sure he was some sort of South American. And old, too, when you saw him close, probably around 68 or 70. Yes, I said, it is wonderful here, isn't it? And who might ask are all these? These is no hotel people? Well, I think they're American sailors. Americans learning to be sailors. Of course they are Americans. Who else in the world is going to make a noise such as this, eh? You are not American, no? No, I'm not. Suddenly one of the American cadets was standing in front of us. He was dripping wet from the pool, and one of the English girls was standing there with him. Are these chairs taken, he said. No. Mind if I sit down? Go ahead. Thanks. He had a towel in his hand. When he sat down, he unrolled it, produced a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. Offered the cigarettes to the girl, and she refused. Offered them to me, and I took one. Little man said,
think you know, but I think I have a cigar. He pulled out a crocodile case, got himself a cigar, produced a knife which had a small scissors in it, snipped the end off the cigar. Oh, here, let me give you a light, the American boy, and held up his lighter. Oh, that will not work in this wind? Sure, it'll work. It always works. Always. Sure, it never fails. Not with me, anyway. Well, well. So you say this famous lighter, it never fails. Is that what you say? Sure. That's right. The boy was about 19 or 20 with a long, freckled face and a rather sharp, bird-like nose. His chest was not very sunburned. There were freckles there, too, and a few wisps of pale, reddish hair. He was holding the lighter in his right hand, ready to flip the wheel. It never fails. I promise you, it never fails. One moment, please. Now, just one moment. Shall we not perhaps make a little bet on that? Shall we not make a little bet on whether your lighter lights? Sure, I'll bet, said the boy. Why not? You would like to bet? Sure, I'll always bet. The man paused and examined his cigar. And I must say, I didn't much like the way he was behaving. Seemed he was already trying to make something out of this and to embarrass the boy, and at the same time I had the feeling he was relishing a private little secret all his own. He looked up again at the boy and said slowly, I like to bet too. Why, we don't have a good bet on this thing, eh? A good, big bet. Now, wait a minute. I can't do that, but I'll bet you a quarter. I'll even bet you $1 or whatever it is they have over here, some shillings, I guess. No. Listen to me. Now we have some fun. We make a bet. We go up to my room in the hotel, there's no wind. I bet you cannot light this famous lighter of yours 10 times. 10 times running without missing once. Oh, I'll bet I can, said the boy. All right, good. We make a bet, yes? Sure. I'll bet you $1. No. I make you a very good bet. I am a rich man. I am a sporting man also. Listen to me. Outside the hotel is my car. It's a very fine car, an American car from your country, a Cadillac. Oh, no, wait a minute. I cannot put up that sort of property. This is crazy. No, not crazy at all. You strike lighter successfully 10 times running, Cadillac is yours. You like to have this Cadillac, yes? Sure. I'd like to have a Cadillac. All right, fine. We make a bet. I put up my Cadillac. And what do I put up? I never ask you, my friend, to put up something you cannot afford. You understand? Then what do I bet? I make it very easy for you, yes? Okay, you make it easy. Some small thing you can afford to give away, and if you did happen to lose it, you would not feel so bad, all right? Such as what? Such as perhaps the little finger of your left hand. My what? Yes, why not? You win, you take the car, you lose, I take the finger. I don't get it. How do you mean you take the finger? I chop it off. Jumping jeepers! That's a crazy bet. I think I'll just make it $1. Little man leaned back, spread out his hands, palm upward, gave a tiny contemptuous shrug of his shoulders. Well, I do not understand. You say it lights, but you will not bet. Then we forget it, yes? The boy sat quite still, staring at the bathers in the pool. Suddenly he remembered he hadn't lighted a cigarette. He put it between his lips, cupped his hands around the lighter, flipped the wheel. The wick lighted and burned with a small, steady yellow flame, and the way he held his hands, the wind didn't get to it at all. Could I have a light, too, I said. Oh, gee, I'm sorry. I forgot you didn't have one. I held out my hand for the lighter, but he stood up and came over and did it for me. Thank you, I said. And he returned to his seat. You having a good time, I said. Fine. It's pretty nice here. There was silence then. I could see the little man had succeeded in disturbing the boy with his absurd proposal. Now, just let me check you up on this little bet of yours. You say, we go up to your room, I make this lighter light 10 times, you give me a Cadillac. If it misses just once, I forfeit the little finger of my left hand. Is that right? Certainly, that is the bet. But I think you are afraid. What do we do if I lose? Do I have to hold my finger out while you chop it off? Oh, no. That would be no good, and you might be tempted to refuse to hold it out, eh? What I should do is, I should tie one of your hands to the table before we started, and I should stand there with a knife, ready to go chop the moment your lighter missed. What year is the Cadillac? Excuse me, what year? How old? Oh, how old? Ah, yes, it is last year. Quite new car. But I see you are not betting man. Americans never are. The boy paused for just a moment. He looked at the English girl. He looked at me. Yes. I'll bet you. Good. Fine. We do it now. And you, sir? He said to me, you would perhaps be good enough to what you call it, to referee? Well, I think it's a crazy bet, I said. I don't think I like it very much. Nor do I, said the English girl. It was the first time she'd spoken. I think it's a ridiculous, stupid bet. Are you serious about cutting off this boy's finger if he loses? Certainly I am. Also about giving him Cadillac if he win. Come now, we go up to my room. The boy said to me, I'd consider it a favor if you'd come along and referee. All right, I said, if I come along, I'll come along, fine. But I don't like the bet. You come too, he said to the girl. You come and watch. Little man led the way through the garden to where we could see the front driveway of the hotel, and he stopped and he pointed to a sleek, pale green Cadillac that was parked close by. There she is, the green one. You like, eh? Hey, that's a nice car. All right, now we go up and see if you can win her. He unlocked his door, and we all trooped into what was a large, pleasant double bedroom. There was a woman's dressing gown lying across the bottom of one of the beds. He rang for the maid, gave her a pound note from his wallet. You will do something for me now, please. We are going to play a little game in here. I want you to go off and find for me three things. Some nails, a hammer, and a chopping knife. A butcher's chopping knife, which you can borrow from the kitchen. You can get, yes? A chopping knife? You mean a real chopping knife? Yes, of course. Come on now, please. You can find those things surely for me. All right. Yes, sir, I'll try, sir. Surely I'll try to get them. And she went. The little man handed round martinis. We stood there and sipped them. The boy, bare-bodied except for a pair of faded brown bathing shorts. The English girl, a large, brown, fair-haired girl, wearing a pale blue bathing suit, watching the boy over the top of her glass all the time. The little man in his immaculate white suit drinking his martini and looking at the girl. I didn't know what to make of it all. The man seemed serious about the bet, and he seemed serious about the business of cutting off the finger. But what if the boy lost? Then we'd have to rush him to the hospital in the Cadillac that he hadn't won. That would be a fine thing. Don't you think this is rather a silly bet, I said. I think it's a fine bet, said the boy. I think it's a stupid, ridiculous bet, said the girl. What'll happen if you lose? Won't matter. Come to think of it, I can't remember ever in my life having had any use for the little finger in my left hand. Well, there he is. Here he is, and he hasn't ever done a thing for me yet. So why shouldn't I bet him? I think it's a fine bet. Before we begin, said the little man, I will present to the referee the key of the car. The papers, the owning papers and insurance are in the pocket of the car. The maid came in again. In one hand she carried a small chopper, the kind used by butchers for chopping meat bones, and in the other a hammer and a bag of nails. Good, you get them all. Thank you, now you can go. He waited until the maid had closed the door, and then he put the implements on one of the beds. Now, we prepare ourselves, yes? Help me, please, with this table. We carry it out a little. The two of them carried the small hotel writing desk into the room away from the wall. And now, a chair. He was very brisk and animated, like a person organizing games at a children's party. And now the nails. I must put in the nails. We stood there, the boy, the girl, and I, watching the little man at work. We watched him hammer 2 nails into the table, about 6 inches apart. He didn't hammer them right home. He allowed a small part of each one to stick up, and he tested them for firmness with his fingers. Anyone would think he had done this before, I thought. He never hesitates. Table, nails, hammer, kitchen chopper. He knows exactly what he needs and how to arrange it. And now he said, all we want is some string. He found some string. All right, at last we are ready. Will you please to sit here at the table? Now, place the left hand between these 2 nails. The nails are only so I can tie your hand in place. All right, good. Now I tie your hand securely to the table. So, he wound the string around the boy's wrist, several times around the wide part of the hand, then he fastened it tight to the nails. He made a good job of it. When he finished, there wasn't any question about the boy being able to draw his hand away, but he could move his fingers. Now, please, clench the fist, all except for the little finger. You must leave the little finger sticking out, lying on the table. Excellent, excellent. Now we are ready. With your right hand, you manipulate the lighter. But one moment, please. He skipped over to the bed and he picked up the chopper. He came back and stood beside the table with the chopper in his hand. We are all ready? Mr. Referee, you must say to begin. The English girl was standing there in her pale blue bathing costume right behind the boy's chair. She was just standing there, not saying anything. The boy was sitting quite still, holding the lighter in his right hand, looking up at the chopper. The little man was looking at me. "Are you ready?" I asked the boy. "I'm ready." "And you?" "Quite ready." He lifted the chopper up in the air and he held it there about 2 feet above the boy's finger, ready to chop. The boy watched it, but he didn't flinch, and his mouth didn't move at all. He merely raised his eyebrows and frowned. "All right," I said, "go ahead." The boy said, "Will you please count aloud the number of times I light it?" "I'll do that." With his thumb, he raised the top of the lighter, and again with the thumb he gave the wheel a sharp flick. The flint sparked, and the wick caught fire and burned with a small yellow flame. "One," I called. He didn't blow the flame out. He closed the top of the lighter on it and he waited for perhaps 5 seconds before opening it again. He flicked the wheel very strongly, and once more there was a small flame burning on the wick. "Two," I said. No one else said anything. The boy kept his eyes on the lighter. The little man held the chopper up in the air, and he too was watching the lighter. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. Obviously, it was one of those lighters that worked. The flint gave a big spark, and the wick was the right length. I watched the thumb snapping the top down onto the flame, then a pause, then the thumb raising the top once more. It was an all-thumb operation. The thumb did everything. I took a breath, ready to say 8. The thumb flicked the wheel, the flint sparked, a little flame appeared. 8, I said. And at that moment, the door opened. We all turned, and we saw a woman standing in the doorway, a small, black-haired woman, rather old, who stood there for about 2 seconds, then rushed forward, shouting, "Come!" She grabbed his wrist, took the chopper from him, threw it on the bed, took hold of the little man by the lapels of his white suit and began shaking him very vigorously, talking to him fast and loud and fiercely in some Spanish-sounding language. She shook him so fast she couldn't see him anymore. He became a faint, misty, quickly moving outline like the spokes of a turning wheel. Then she hauled him across the room and pushed him backward onto one of the beds. He sat on the edge of it, blinking his eyes and testing his head to see if it would still turn on his neck. "I am so sorry," said the woman. "I am so terribly sorry that this should happen." She spoke almost perfect English. "It is too bad. I suppose it is really my fault. For 10 minutes I leave him alone to go and have my hair washed, and I come back and he is at it again." The boy was untying his hand from the table. The English girl and I stood there and said nothing. "He is a menace," the woman said. "Down where we live at home, he has taken altogether 47 fingers from different people and given away 11 cars. In the end, they threatened to have him put away somewhere. That's why I brought him up here." "We were only having a little bet." "I suppose he bet you a car?" "Yes, a Cadillac." "He has no car. It's mine. And that makes it worse. That he should bet you when he has nothing to bet with. I am ashamed and very sorry about it all." She seemed an awfully nice woman. "Well," I said, "then here's the key of your car." I put it on the table. "We were only having a little bet." "He hasn't anything left to bet with. He hasn't a thing in the world. Not a thing. As a matter of fact, I myself won it all from him a long while ago. It took time. A lot of time. And it was hard work. But I won it all in the end." She looked up at the boy and she smiled, a slow, sad smile, and she came over and put out a hand to take the key from the table. I can see it now, that hand of hers. It had only one finger and a thumb. You can just imagine what that was like on TV. In fact, I believe in the Hitchcock version, as she's shaking the life out of the man, they very shakily light themselves a cigarette. The boy lights his lighter, what would have been number 9, and it doesn't light. Which brings us, it doesn't bring us at all, but I will pretend it does, to Edgar Allan Poe. Speaking of nutcases. We tend to think of Edgar Allan Poe as seriously off his rocker. Maybe because most of his scary stories were in first person. He always wrote about how I am going to kill him, or how I can't take it anymore, or I have a fear of being buried alive. Tends to blur the line between author and character.
Poe, was always interested in creating a mood or an effect more than he was interested in telling a story. That's why often we have a murder without a motive. He decided first what impact a story should have, what ending it should be going toward, and then he chose every word to focus on that event and drive toward that purpose. He wanted to manipulate the reader. He was a little too good at it, maybe. That's why we think he's nuts. I'm not saying Poe was a model citizen. He knew he was a little off his rocker. He was nervous. He was high-strung. He was often sickly young man. He had real trouble getting along with people. He often said his senses were heightened, making him oversensitive in both meanings of the word. One of many traits that he shared with his characters. Like this jumpy, oversensitive man, more interested in making us think he's sane than convincing us he's innocent of murder. The telltale heart. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses. Not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I could hear all things in the heaven and in the earth. I could hear many things in hell. Why then will you say that I am mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my head, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light should shine out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon the bed. Ah! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights. Every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed. And so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did I. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened for fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night.
hearkening to the death-watch beetles in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifling sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, it is nothing but a wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp. Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, though he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head in the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a little, very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open. Wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, directly upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder, louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes more, I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. Louder! I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited it all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, still dark as midnight. As the bells sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? there entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. Ah! A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bid the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bid them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached. Fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat, still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such as a sound a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise... I rose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark! Louder! 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 Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more, I admit the deed. Tear up the blanks, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart. I want to finish up with one more bit of Edgar Allan Poe, probably his most famous bit. Poe is very strange, very hard to understand sometimes. He gets into complicated symbolism and all that English literature class stuff. Telltale Heart is a little more straightforward than most of his. Nothing too supernatural is happening, although supernatural makes a nice story too. We can easily see where the narrator, tension riding high, could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears and think it's the old man's heart. But just as something to think about, there seem to be a lot of similarities between the old man and the younger, almost as if he's another part of himself. Is it possible that there is no old man? Or at least that there is no dead old man under the floorboards, since we never see the police tear up the floor? We have only the word of a very unreliable narrator that the whole thing happened. Something to think about. Just to mess with your head. Anyway, Poe was known in his time, especially around America, most for one poem. And in his philosophy of composition, he set out to explain how, clearly and rationally, and step by step, how he wrote it. It's very strange to hear Poe writing like a normal person. In fact, he's so insistently rational. He sounds like the narrator of Telltale Heart. It almost sounds like he's trying too hard to be sane, but never mind that. Anyway, in this poem,
not much happens. It's all internal. Brooding young man, distraught over the death of the woman he loved, is reading to himself late on a stormy night, trying to drive the girl from his thoughts so he can get some sleep. Suddenly a tapping at the door makes him jump. Maybe he's been dreaming of ghosts. In any case, the visitor is simply a bird seeking shelter from the storm. A bird that, parrot-like, answers him with one word, no matter what the question he asks. But this is no colorful parrot. This black bird is a symbol of death, the raven. You may remember how in the movie The Crow, the black bird always accompanies death. Real symbolic kind of a bird, slice of nightmare. And it croaks a word, or what sounds like a word to his fevered brain. It says no. It says never. It says never again. Unable to keep his lost love out of his mind, the young man asks questions of the spirit of the underworld about this land beyond death. And each time he gets an answer, a no answer, that enrages him further. Now, Poe himself suggested in this essay that the young man is so wallowing in self-pity and grief and enjoying that wallowing that he is, at least on some unconscious level, deliberately asking questions to which a no answer will plunge him further into despair. At the end, he says, the shadow of the bird will be over him forever. That is, that he will never forget her, or never emerge from the shadow of death that is over his heart. Just so you know what I'm talking about in a minute. Of course, we have to wonder, is the bird really saying anything? Is the bird just an ordinary bird? Is there any bird in the room at all? Or is it just a dream or a metaphor? It doesn't matter. To Poe, all that matters is the effect, the mood he creates in you. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Once, upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. Some late visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Merely this and nothing more. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood, repeating to some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortals ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. That I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Only this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again there came a tapping, something louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is in this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven.
of the saintly days of yore. Oh, not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore? Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Not a feather then he fluttered, nothing further than he uttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast, and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never and nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust in door. Then upon the cushion sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er. But whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget the lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still of bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore. Desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me, truly I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still of bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or friend, I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy form from off my door, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting. Still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. Thank you. Thank you very much.